Sparta did not lose because it was weak. It hesitated because it was strong. In the long struggle for dominance in the Greek world, Sparta repeatedly found itself in a position most military powers dream of: battlefield superiority, disciplined infantry, and enemies who could be broken if only the final blow were delivered faster. And yet, again and again, Sparta slowed down. Campaigns stretched. Pressure was applied, then eased. Opportunities to finish wars decisively were left deliberately incomplete. Why would the most militarized society of the ancient world fear a rapid victory? Why would a state built entirely around war choose restraint instead of annihilation? And why did this decision, meant to preserve Sparta's power, plant the seeds of long-term instability instead? This is not a story about tactical hesitation. It is a story about a system that understood something most armies ignore: that victory itself can be destabilizing, and that winning too fast can destroy what war was meant to protect. To understand Sparta's strategy, we must first understand the problem victory created. At its core, this episode is not about a single battle, a single general, or a single miscalculation. It is about a strategic paradox. Sparta's leadership faced a problem that no military doctrine openly prepares for: how to fight a war you are capable of winning, without allowing that victory to unravel your own system. A fast, decisive victory would not simply eliminate external threats. It would accelerate internal pressures, social control, alliance expectations, resource redistribution, and political consequences that Sparta's rigid structure was not designed to absorb all at once. So instead of asking the conventional question, "How do we win?" Sparta asked a more dangerous one: how much victory can we survive? This choice violated the basic instincts of warfare. It contradicted the logic of momentum, morale, and decisive action. And it placed Sparta in a position where every additional month of war carried both safety and risk. This is why the strategy is genuinely unorthodox. Not because it was clever, but because it was necessary under constraints most armies refused to acknowledge. To see why Sparta believed speed was the real danger, we need to map the situation it was trapped inside. Sparta did not operate in a vacuum. Its choices were shaped and constrained by a strategic environment that punished speed as much as weakness. To understand why slowing down became rational, we need to strip the map of romantic ideas about hoplites and battlefield honor, and look at the system Sparta was actually managing. A power surrounded by limits. On the surface, Sparta appeared dominant. Its land forces were unmatched in discipline. Its military culture was singular, uncompromising, and purpose-built for war. In direct confrontation on open terrain, few rivals could stand their ground. But this superiority masked a deeper reality. Sparta's strength was narrow. It was optimized for a specific kind of conflict, under specific conditions, against specific opponents. Anything outside that envelope introduced risk. Sparta faced adversaries who did not need to defeat its army outright. They only needed to survive long enough to exploit Sparta's structural weaknesses. The real battlefield was not the front line. The decisive constraints were not tactical. They were systemic. First, geography and force projection. Sparta was fundamentally a land power. It relied on proximity, seasonal campaigning, and predictable logistics. Extended operations strained its ability to keep forces mobilized without eroding domestic stability. Second, the alliance structure. Sparta did not rule alone. Its power rested on a network of allies who provided manpower, legitimacy, and strategic depth. But alliances are not static assets. They are dynamic systems with expectations. A rapid, overwhelming victory would force immediate questions. Who gets rewarded? Who gains influence? Who feels marginalized? Every decisive win accelerated political bargaining inside the alliance, bargaining Sparta could not fully control. Third, internal security. Sparta governed a society built on permanent domination over a much larger subordinate population. Its military excellence was inseparable from constant internal vigilance. Large-scale or prolonged troop deployments created gaps at home. Gaps that did not need to become revolts to be dangerous. They only needed to introduce uncertainty. Sparta could not afford to fight as if the rear was secure. Because it never was. Time is a strategic variable. Most military planning treats time as something to minimize. Shorter wars mean fewer losses, fewer surprises, fewer costs. For Sparta, time worked differently. Speed created shocks. Shocks created political acceleration. Acceleration destabilized systems that relied on slow, predictable control. A long war, managed carefully, did something else. It normalized pressure. As long as the conflict remained unresolved, allies remained dependent. Rivals remained contained. Internal order remained justifiable under permanent emergency. In this context, war was not only an instrument of victory. It was an instrument of equilibrium. Ending it too quickly meant losing that equilibrium. The opponent's hidden advantages. Sparta's rivals did not need to defeat Spartan forces head-on. They possessed advantages that emerged over time. Maritime mobility. Financial flexibility. Adaptive command structures. Access to external partners. These strengths grew more dangerous the longer the war lasted, but they also became visible only if Sparta tried to force closure too early. A decisive Spartan victory risked pushing opponents toward desperate, asymmetric responses. Responses that bypassed the battlefield and targeted the system. By slowing the conflict, Sparta attempted to manage not just enemy actions, but enemy choices. To keep them reactive, cautious, uncertain. The illusion of control. From the outside, this strategy looked passive, even timid. But inside Spartan decision-making, it was framed as control. Control over escalation. Control over alliance expectations. Control over internal exposure. The assumption was simple and dangerous. That Sparta could regulate the pace of war without losing the initiative. That it could apply pressure without triggering collapse. That it could delay resolution without empowering adaptation. This assumption was never guaranteed. But at the time, it appeared preferable to the alternative. What Sparta could not see. Every strategic map has blind zones. Sparta underestimated how prolonged conflict changes opponents. Not tactically, but psychologically. Endurance breeds innovation. Constraint breeds creativity. The longer the war persisted, the more Sparta's adversaries learned how to fight around its strengths rather than against them. Yet from Sparta's perspective, the immediate danger was not external transformation. It was internal disruption. And so the map it used to guide decisions emphasized containment over closure, stability over dominance, delay over decision. A choice born from constraint, not confidence. This was not a strategy chosen from abundance. It was chosen because all faster paths carried unacceptable risks. Sparta was not asking how to maximize victory. It was asking how to avoid systemic shock. That distinction matters. Because once you see the war this way, speed stops being a virtue. It becomes a liability. And from that realization, a profoundly unorthodox decision began to take shape. Because if every conventional path led to instability, then the only viable option was the one doctrine warned against, slowing the war down on purpose. Military doctrine is built on repetition. It rewards patterns that worked before, under conditions that feel familiar. Sparta's problem was not a lack of doctrine. It was that doctrine offered solutions that solved the battle, while endangering the system. What a normal commander would have done. Given Sparta's advantages, orthodox strategy pointed in one direction. Concentrate forces. Seek decisive engagement. Exploit superior discipline. Break the enemy's main army. Force political submission. This was not reckless thinking. It was rational, historically validated, and widely accepted. Decisive victory promised clarity. Clear outcomes. Clear hierarchy. Clear deterrence. For most polities, this was the end state war was designed to reach. And this is precisely why it was dangerous for Sparta. Why decisive victory was structurally incompatible. Doctrine assumes that victory consolidates power. Sparta lived inside an exception. A rapid victory would compress multiple destabilizing processes into a short time window. First, alliance realignment. Decisive victory forces redistribution. Territory, prestige, spoils, influence, nothing remains abstract. Sparta's allies would demand compensation. Some would gain too much. Others would feel excluded. Either outcome created friction. Doctrine treated allies as force multipliers. Sparta had to treat them as variables that could escape control. Second, internal exposure. Doctrine assumes the home front stabilizes after victory. Sparta's internal order relied on constant military readiness. Demobilization was not relief, it was risk. Troops returning home quickly did not strengthen stability. They disrupted routines, hierarchies, and surveillance mechanisms. Doctrine never accounts for a society that cannot safely relax. Third, escalation beyond the battlefield. A crushing Spartan victory would not end resistance. It would displace it. Economic warfare. Naval harassment. External sponsorship of dissent. The more decisive the win, the more incentive opponents had to abandon conventional confrontation altogether. Doctrine promised closure. Reality promised mutation. The doctrine blind spot, victory as a destabilizer. Classical military thinking assumes a linear relationship. More success, more control. Sparta operated in a nonlinear environment. Beyond a certain threshold, success produced diminishing returns, and then negative ones. Too much dominance triggered fear among allies, desperation among enemies, strain inside rigid institutions. Doctrine does not warn commanders about this threshold. It rarely exists in textbooks. But Sparta was living on it. Why deviation looked like weakness. To observers trained in conventional logic, restraint appeared irrational. Pressure without annihilation looked inefficient. Opportunities not taken looked like fear. Even within Sparta, this deviation created tension. Military culture prizes action. Hesitation corrodes legitimacy. Choosing delay required justifying inaction as intent. That is one of the hardest positions a command authority can occupy. Because if the strategy works, it looks invisible. If it fails, it looks incompetent. Doctrine offers protection, I followed the rules. Deviation offers none. The paradox of disciplined restraint. Sparta's doctrine emphasized obedience, endurance, and control. But doctrine had been designed for fighting, not for managing victory. The restraint Sparta attempted required a different discipline. Not the discipline to advance, but the discipline to stop. Not the discipline to seize advantage, but the discipline to leave advantage partially unused. This is where doctrine became not just inadequate, but misleading. It trained commanders to fear hesitation more than escalation, to fear delay more than collapse. Sparta's leaders inverted that fear hierarchy. They feared collapse more than delay. When doctrine becomes a liability, doctrine works best in stable systems. Sparta's system was brittle, highly optimized, highly constrained, highly sensitive to shock. Under such conditions, rigid adherence to doctrine increases risk instead of reducing it. The more aggressively Sparta pursued doctrinal victory, the more pressure it applied to the very structures that sustained its power. Doctrine offered speed. Sparta required balance. Doctrine offered clarity. Sparta required ambiguity. Doctrine offered endings. Sparta required suspension. The cost of rejecting the rulebook. Rejecting doctrine did not remove danger. It redistributed it. By slowing the war, Sparta accepted longer exposure to adaptation, greater uncertainty over time, the constant risk that control would slip quietly rather than collapse loudly. But compared to the doctrinal alternative, this risk felt survivable. Not safe. Just survivable. And that distinction defined the strategy. A strategy born from contradiction. Sparta did not abandon doctrine because it rejected military logic. It abandoned doctrine because it understood something doctrine could not model. That war is not fought only against enemies. It is fought against consequences. And sometimes, the most dangerous consequence of war is winning too well. This realization did not produce a clear plan. It produced a constraint. From that constraint, a decision emerged, not elegant, not comfortable, but internally consistent. A decision that would now have to be executed without precedent, without protection, and without the reassurance of doctrine. This decision did not arrive fully formed. It emerged under pressure, through friction, disagreement, and unresolved fear. No council convenes to announce that it will avoid victory. That language is politically lethal. Instead, the idea took shape indirectly, through constraints, objections, and a narrowing of acceptable options. Where the idea surfaced. Inside Sparta's decision-making system, authority was distributed. Not chaotic, but layered. Military leaders carried operational responsibility. Political institutions guarded continuity. Social norms enforced rigidity. This structure did not encourage innovation. It filtered it. Any proposal that openly rejected decisive victory would be rejected immediately. So the argument had to be reframed. Not as restraint, but as control. Not as delay, but as sustainability. Not as fear, but as prudence. The question that gained traction was not whether to win. It was how fast the system could absorb that win. The objections were immediate. There was resistance. From commanders trained to exploit advantage. From allies who equated speed with commitment. From internal factions who feared loss of prestige. The objections followed a familiar pattern. Delay wastes momentum. Delay signals weakness. Delay invites interference. None of these claims were wrong. They were incomplete. The counterargument did not deny them. It reframed the hierarchy of risk. Yes, delay risks adaptation. But speed risks fracture. Yes, restraint looks weak. But collapse is worse. Yes, control can slip. But uncontrolled victory detonates. This was not a debate about tactics. It was a debate about which failure mode was survivable. The core assumptions behind the decision. The emerging strategy rested on several assumptions. None were comfortable. None were provable in advance. First assumption. Sparta could regulate escalation without losing initiative. That pressure could be applied selectively. That intensity could be modulated. That the enemy would remain reactive rather than adaptive. This assumed informational advantage and psychological dominance. Both fragile. Second assumption. Allies would tolerate ambiguity. That they would accept a prolonged conflict as responsible management, not indecision. That benefits deferred would not become resentment. This required constant signaling. And constant credibility. Third assumption. Internal stability was more time-sensitive than external resolution. That a rapid victory would produce shocks faster than institutions could absorb them. That maintaining emergency conditions was safer than transitioning to peace. This was the most dangerous assumption. Because it treated war not as a temporary state, but as a stabilizing mechanism. What the strategy was actually targeting. This was not a strategy aimed primarily at enemy armies. It targeted systems. Enemy expectations. Alliance behavior. Internal rhythms of control. By slowing the war, Sparta aimed to keep opponents uncertain about thresholds. Prevent allies from recalculating too quickly. Avoid sudden shifts in domestic posture. In effect, the strategy attempted to stretch time. To spread consequences thin enough that none became catastrophic. This is why it cannot be reduced to indecision. It was a deliberate attempt to manage causality. Why this decision felt rational at the time. From inside the system, the choice felt constrained rather than bold. Every faster option carried visible, immediate danger. Every slower option carried diffuse, delayed risk. Human institutions consistently choose the latter. Diffuse risk is easier to justify. Immediate catastrophe is not. Sparta's leadership was not gambling on brilliance. They were avoiding obvious disaster. That distinction matters. Because it explains why the decision did not feel heroic. It felt necessary. The silent compromise at the center. There was an unspoken trade-off. By choosing to slow the war, Sparta accepted that it was surrendering one form of control in exchange for another. It gave up decisive clarity, moral dominance, the ability to end the conflict on its own terms. In return, it hoped to preserve internal order, alliance hierarchy, predictable pressure dynamics. This was not an equal exchange. It was a calculated one. Why this decision was so difficult to reverse? Once implemented, the strategy became self-reinforcing. Slowing the war changed expectations, changed deployments, changed narratives. Re-accelerating later would look like panic or loss of control. So the decision locked Sparta into a narrow corridor. Too slow, and adaptation would outpace control. Too fast, an internal shock would return. The margin for error was thin. And it only got thinner over time. The unspoken fear beneath it all. Beneath the formal arguments was a simpler fear. Sparta did not fully trust its own victory. Not because it doubted its soldiers, but because it doubted its system's flexibility. Victory demands transformation. Sparta was built to resist it. So instead of transforming to fit victory, Sparta tried to reshape victory to fit itself. That is the essence of this unorthodox choice. Not brilliance. Not cowardice. Constraint management under existential pressure. And from that moment forward, everything depended on execution. Because a strategy that relies on controlled delay collapses the instant control slips, even slightly. Execution was where this strategy stopped being theoretical and became dangerous. On paper, controlled delay sounds elegant. In practice, it is unforgiving. Every mechanism must function. Every signal must be calibrated. Every deviation compounds. Sparta did not merely slow the war. It attempted to administer it, turning delay into a system. The first challenge was operational. A slow war cannot look like paralysis. It must look intentional. Spartan operations emphasized pressure without closure. Campaigns were launched with limited objectives. Engagements were decisive, but not terminal. Momentum was applied, then deliberately capped. This created a rhythm. Advance. Apply force. Withdraw before collapse. The aim was not to break the enemy's capacity to fight. It was to keep the capacity just intact enough to avoid triggering uncontrolled reactions. That required restraint at moments when restraint felt unnatural. The logistics of endurance. A prolonged conflict shifts the burden from combat effectiveness to logistical resilience. Sparta adjusted its mobilization cycles. Forces rotated. Commitments were measured against seasonal and domestic requirements. This minimized peak strain. But it also introduced friction. A system optimized for decisive engagement struggles with long-duration management. Supplies must flow steadily, not massively. Morale must be maintained without the promise of closure. The army was kept effective, but not consumed. This balance was fragile. Every additional month increased cumulative cost. Not in dramatic losses, but in erosion. Managing allies through ambiguity. Execution required constant political signaling. Allies had to believe Sparta was in control. Not hesitating. Not stalling. This meant visible action, without irreversible escalation. Joint operations were structured to demonstrate commitment while limiting consequences. Victories were shared carefully. Rewards deferred. Too much success risked empowering allies beyond their place in the hierarchy. Too little risked alienation. Sparta walked a narrow line. And allies watched closely. The psychological burden on command. For commanders, this was the most corrosive aspect. Military leadership thrives on clarity. This strategy denied it. Orders were precise, but goals remained open-ended. Success was defined negatively: avoid collapse rather than achieve resolution. This breeds doubt. Not open dissent, but quiet erosion of confidence. Was restraint still strategic? Or had it become habit? The longer the war continued, the harder it became to distinguish discipline from inertia. Where the plan almost broke. There were moments when the system nearly failed. Moments when momentum surged beyond control. Or when restraint created unexpected vulnerability. A limited operation achieved more than anticipated. The enemy reeled. Allies pressed for escalation. At that point, stopping felt unnatural and politically risky. Conversely, restraint sometimes signaled weakness. Opponents tested boundaries. Probed supply lines. Explored alternatives to direct confrontation. Each test forced rapid recalibration. Too strong a response would shatter the illusion of control. Too weak a response would invite exploitation. This constant adjustment taxed decision-makers. Micro-twist, adaptation quietly begins. The most dangerous threat did not arrive as a crisis. It arrived as learning. Opponents began to understand the pattern. They noticed thresholds that were never crossed. Escalations that always stopped short. Opportunities Sparta declined to pursue. This recognition changed their behavior. They stopped waiting for decisive defeat. They started planning around persistence. Time, once Sparta's stabilizing variable, began to empower adaptation. And adaptation does not announce itself. It accumulates. The illusion of manageability. The strategy assumed control could be maintained indefinitely. That delay would remain asymmetric, benefiting Sparta more than its rivals. But prolonged conflict erodes asymmetry. What begins as management becomes maintenance. Maintenance becomes routine. Routine becomes vulnerability. The system continued to function, but at increasing cost. Decision-makers were forced to intervene more frequently. Signals grew more complex. Margins shrank. What had once been strategic choice began to feel like obligation. The point of no return. At some stage, slowing the war ceased to be optional. Re-accelerating would have required admitting miscalculation. It would have disrupted alliances. It would have shocked domestic expectations. The strategy locked itself in. This is the hidden danger of controlled delay. Once you commit, reversal is no longer neutral. It is destabilizing. Execution as a test of endurance. Sparta succeeded, for a time, in making delay operational. It held the line between pressure and collapse. Between dominance and exposure. But execution revealed a truth the strategy could not escape. Control is not static. It decays. And the longer a system relies on restraint to preserve itself, the more vulnerable it becomes to forces that do not need to win, only to wait. Which raises the question that defines the next phase of this story. What happens when the opponent stops reacting and starts exploiting the delay itself? At first, Sparta's opponents reacted exactly as expected. They treated delay as weakness. They read restraint as hesitation. They assumed time favored the stronger army, not the weaker coalition. That assumption bought Sparta space. But reactions do not remain static. They evolve. And the moment adaptation began, the logic of the war shifted. The first misreading, confusing restraint with fear. In the early phase, the enemy interpreted Sparta's controlled tempo through a conventional lens. If Sparta was not closing, it must be uncertain. If it was not escalating, it must be constrained. If it was not decisive, it must be waiting for something it lacked. This interpretation encouraged caution. Opponents avoided catastrophic gambles. They preserved forces. They focused on survival rather than initiative. From Sparta's perspective, this was success. Delay had induced passivity. But passivity is temporary. Learning the pattern. Over time, a pattern emerged. Spartan pressure had limits. Escalation stopped at predictable thresholds. Certain opportunities were never pursued to completion. Once noticed, these limits stopped being reassuring. They became exploitable. Opponents began to test the edges. A raid here. A maneuver there. Nothing decisive, just probes. The responses were firm but bounded. Each probe refined understanding. This was not a failure of Spartan discipline. It was the unavoidable consequence of consistency. Consistency reveals structure. The shift from reaction to strategy. The enemy's most important adjustment was psychological. They stopped waiting for Sparta to make a mistake. They began planning around Sparta's restraint. Instead of asking, "How do we avoid defeat?" they asked, "How do we operate inside this delay?" This changed everything. Resources were allocated for endurance, not victory. Political capital was spent slowly, not urgently. External relationships were cultivated patiently. The war ceased to be an emergency. It became an environment. And environments favor those who adapt, not those who dominate. Where the enemy still miscalculated. Despite adaptation, the enemy never fully understood the rationale behind Sparta's strategy. They continued to believe restraint was tactical, not systemic. That Sparta could abandon delay at will. This misreading persisted. As a result, opponents underestimated the depth of Sparta's internal constraints. They expected sudden escalation that never came. This prevented them from pushing certain advantages aggressively. In that sense, Sparta's delay still distorted enemy expectations. But distortion cuts both ways. The real point of exploitation. The most effective enemy response was not military. It was temporal. By refusing decisive confrontation and instead extending the conflict laterally, politically, economically, diplomatically, the enemy forced Sparta to remain in management mode indefinitely. Management mode drains authority. Command decisions become administrative. Risk tolerance shrinks. Innovation slows. The enemy did not need to defeat Spartan armies. They needed to outlast Spartan control. The moment Sparta lost initiative. Initiative is not about movement. It is about choice. As the war dragged on, Sparta retained tactical initiative, but lost strategic freedom. Every action was evaluated through the same filter. Will this destabilize the system? That filter narrowed options. Opponents sensed this. They began setting the rhythm, not through battles, but through timing. Choosing when to provoke. When to negotiate. When to escalate indirectly. Sparta responded. But it was responding. Misreading control as permanence. Sparta's central error was not restraint. It was assuming restraint could be permanent. Control requires asymmetry. Delay erodes it. As opponents adapted, the war's logic inverted. What once stabilized now constrained. What once protected now exposed. The enemy did not break the strategy. They waited for it to exhaust itself. The final misalignment. By the time Sparta recognized this shift, options were limited. Escalation threatened the very collapse the strategy was meant to avoid. Continuation promised diminishing returns. This is the terminal problem of unorthodox delay strategies. They succeed quietly. And fail quietly. Often too quietly to reverse. Which brings us to the outcome no one planned for. And the price paid for trying to control victory instead of claiming it. By the time the strategic consequences became undeniable, the outcome was already constrained. Not because Sparta had lost battles, but because it had lost room to decide how the war would end. The visible result. On the surface, Sparta achieved what it had aimed to preserve. There was no sudden internal collapse. No immediate rebellion triggered by demobilization. No explosive realignment that shattered its alliance structure overnight. Stability, in the narrow sense, survived. But the victory Sparta avoided did not simply disappear. It transformed. Instead of a decisive conclusion, the war dissolved into an extended condition. One that normalized strain, diluted authority, and redistributed initiative quietly. Sparta did not fall because it lost control in a single moment. It fell because control became thinner every year it was exercised. The human cost. A prolonged war does not announce its casualties loudly. It accumulates them. Losses came in cycles. Small engagements. Raids. Attrition without closure. For soldiers, this meant no catharsis. No final battle that justified sacrifice. Only repetition. Endurance replaced purpose. In rigid military societies, that shift is corrosive. Discipline can absorb pain. It struggles to absorb meaninglessness. Over time, the psychological cost exceeded the tactical one. The logistical burden. Sustained conflict hollowed out reserves. Not through dramatic depletion, but through constant demand. Supplies flowed steadily instead of massively. Resources were allocated to maintenance rather than expansion. This reduced shock, but also reduced recovery. Every year of war lowered the ceiling of what Sparta could mobilize next. Delay protected the system from sudden rupture. It also prevented renewal. The political price. Politically, the strategy extracted its highest toll. Allies grew accustomed to ambiguity. Ambiguity breeds interpretation. Some saw restraint as responsible leadership. Others saw it as self-interested control. As benefits failed to materialize decisively, trust eroded. not into rebellion but into recalculation. Allies began to hedge. Quietly. Gradually. That hedging did not break Sparta's power. It diluted it. The psychological toll on leadership. For decision-makers, the cost was isolation. Every continuation of the strategy required reaffirming the same assumptions. Assumptions that were increasingly difficult to verify. Were they still in control, or simply trapped by earlier choices? The line blurred. Doubt could not be expressed openly. Admitting uncertainty would destabilize the system faster than any enemy action. So the strategy persisted. Not because it was still optimal, but because abandoning it felt more dangerous. What if it had failed outright? It is important to confront the counterfactual. If the strategy had collapsed suddenly, the failure would have been obvious. Internal unrest. Alliance fracture. Rapid escalation. But that did not happen. The real failure mode was slower and harder to diagnose. The system remained intact while its influence thinned. This made the strategy appear successful longer than it truly was. The silent trade-off realized. Sparta preserved short-term stability at the cost of long-term adaptability. By shaping victory to fit its system, it froze the system in place. And when conditions changed, as they always do, rigidity became exposure. This is the price of managing outcomes instead of resolving them. No villains, no heroes. This outcome does not indict restraint as cowardice. Nor does it glorify decisiveness as virtue. It reveals something more uncomfortable. That sometimes, every available option carries strategic decay. And leaders must choose the form it takes. Sparta chose slow erosion over sudden rupture. That choice delayed collapse. It did not prevent it. Which leaves one final question. What does this strategy really teach us about power, victory, and the limits of control? To decode this strategy, we have to strip away the historical costume and confront the underlying logic. Sparta's decision to slow the war was not about patience. It was about fear of transformation. Not fear of defeat, but fear of what victory would force the system to become. What this strategy was really about. At its core, this was not a military strategy. It was a system preservation strategy disguised as warfare. Sparta used conflict as a stabilizing environment. A permanent condition that justified hierarchy, control, and vigilance. In that context, victory was not an end state. It was a disruption. Peace would demand reorganization, redistribution, relaxation of emergency structures. Sparta's institutions were not designed for flexibility. They were designed for endurance. So the war was shaped to fit the system. Not the system reshaped to fit the outcome. That is the strategic inversion most analyses miss. The rule this strategy breaks. Classical military logic rests on a core assumption. Decisive victory consolidates power. Sparta's experience challenges that assumption. Under certain conditions, decisive victory accelerates entropy. Especially when power depends on rigid social control. Alliances are managed through dependency. Internal stability relies on constant mobilization. In such systems, victory introduces more uncertainty than conflict. This is not intuitive. And it is not taught. Because it contradicts the heroic narrative of war. Why this logic is rarely acknowledged. Most military theory is written by winners, or for future winners. It assumes the system that wins is capable of adapting afterward. Sparta was not. Acknowledging that limitation would have meant admitting vulnerability at the core of its identity. So restraint was framed as prudence. Delay as wisdom. Control as superiority. In reality, these were compensations. The dangerous elegance of delay. The strategy worked, temporarily, because it exploited a real asymmetry. Sparta could endure longer than its rivals expected. But endurance is not dominance. And endurance without adaptation eventually inverts advantage. The longer the war lasted, the more the environment rewarded flexibility over discipline. Sparta's system excelled at repetition. Its opponents learned variation. That is the silent pivot point. 3 strategic principles revealed. This case exposes 3 uncomfortable principles that apply far beyond Sparta. First principle. victory is not universally stabilizing. In rigid systems, rapid success can be more destabilizing than prolonged struggle. Second principle. Time is not neutral. Delaying resolution redistributes power toward actors who can adapt quietly while control mechanisms ossify. Third principle. System preservation is not the same as strategic success. Preserving the present often sacrifices the future. These principles do not appear in doctrine because they undermine doctrine's promise of clarity. Could this strategy work elsewhere? Yes, but only under narrow conditions. It requires a dominant actor whose primary threat is internal, not external. An alliance structure that tolerates prolonged ambiguity. Opponents who misread restraint as incapacity. Even then, the margin for error is thin. Delay magnifies uncertainty. And uncertainty eventually demands payment. The final contradiction. Sparta believed it could control victory by slowing it. What it discovered, too late, was that control itself erodes over time. Not dramatically. Incrementally. By the time the erosion becomes visible, options have already narrowed. This is the paradox at the heart of unorthodox restraint. It feels safe because it avoids shocks. It fails because it avoids adaptation. What history usually gets wrong? History often asks, why didn't Sparta press harder? That is the wrong question. The real question is, why was Sparta unable to survive the kind of victory its military could achieve? The answer is not tactical. It is systemic. And it forces a reassessment of what power actually is. Not the ability to win, but the ability to change afterward. Sparta did not misunderstand war. It misunderstood itself. It believed strength could be preserved by controlling outcomes, by slowing time, by managing consequences. For a while, that belief held. The system remained intact. The structure endured. But endurance is not evolution. And war, sooner or later, demands evolution. Sparta chose delay because every faster option threatened collapse. That choice was rational. It was coherent. And it was ultimately limiting. Not because restraint is flawed, but because restraint cannot substitute for transformation. This is the quiet lesson hidden beneath the armor and discipline. The most dangerous moment for a powerful system is not when it is challenged. It is when it wins, and cannot adapt to what winning requires. Power that cannot absorb its own success will eventually be overtaken by systems that can. Not through conquest, but through time.